You can order the front wheel hub assembly used in the video on CarParts.com through the link in the description. Turn your engine off and set the parking brake. We recommend loosening the nut on the end of the CV axle once the vehicle is on the ground. Use a breaker bar and a 32mm socket to unblock the nut on the end of the CV axle. Loosen the wheel lug nuts on the side of the wheel hub you want to replace. In order to change the wheel hub on your vehicle, you need to remove the wheel to loosen the nut at the end of the CV axle. Lift the front of your vehicle. We strongly suggest watching our video on how to jack your Honda Civic safely before carrying out this step. Place the vehicle on the jack stands. You can now remove the wheel. Don't forget to put the wheel under the vehicle. Turn the brake disc inward to make this operation easier. You can now see the ABS sensor. It's common for the components being removed to be seized up, so don't hesitate to brush them and to use penetrating oil to make removal easier. Using a ratchet, an extender, and a 10mm socket, unscrew the ABS sensor's retaining bolt. Using an 18mm wrench, pull out the sensor by jiggling it back and forth to try and loosen it. Using a large flathead screwdriver, pry it out of its slot. Unfortunately, on this vehicle, the sensor is very often seized up and impossible to remove. In our case, the sensor broke in its slot. Using needle nose pliers, unclip the ABS sensor cable from the strut foot. Next, unclip the ABS sensor cable from its retaining tab. Finally, using a flathead screwdriver, unclip the plastic guide from the body. Next, using a fork, remove the two rivets holding the engine's plastic cover. Then take off the cover. Use a fork to remove the ABS sensor cable connector from its support. Then, disconnect the electrical connector by pressing the plastic tab. It is now time to remove the outer tie rod from the knuckle. The components to be removed are very often seized up, so don't hesitate to brush and to use penetrating oil to make removal easier. Remove the cotter pin from the nut of the outer tie rod with a screwdriver, a hammer, and pliers. Using a 19mm wrench, unscrew the outer tie rod holding nut. If you do not have a ball joint puller, a tool specifically designed for this task, take a hammer and hit the knuckle. The ball joint should come out of the knuckle. Unscrew the nut from the outer tie rod and remove it. In order to remove the wheel hub on this vehicle, you need to remove the disc and pad assembly. For more information, we recommend watching our video, How to Replace the Front Brake Discs and Brake Pads, Honda Civic. Turn the disc outwards. This will facilitate the following steps. Using a socket wrench, an extender, and a 17mm socket, unscrew the two holding bolts on the caliper mount. Depending on the state of the bolts on the caliper mount, it may be necessary to use a hammer to loosen them. Remove the caliper assembly and hang it on the hook. You must then separate the front lower ball joint from the control arm. Using a ratchet and a 17mm socket, unscrew the bolt holding the front lower ball joint to the lower control arm. Using a ratchet and a 19mm socket, unscrew the two nuts holding the front lower ball joint to the lower control arm. Using a Phillips screwdriver, loosen the two screws holding the disc. Finally, remove the disc. Finish unscrewing the hub nut by hand. Once the disc has been removed, you need to disengage the strut foot from the wheel knuckle. To prevent the wheel knuckle unit from falling off, lift the front axle slightly with a jack while being supported by the lower control arm. Using a ratchet and a 21mm socket, unscrew the strut foot retaining nuts. Hold the bolts using a 17mm wrench. Remove the two retaining bolts. Using a crowbar, free the strut foot from the wheel knuckle. The strut foot is now free. You can now remove the CV axle from the hub by pulling on the wheel knuckle. The wheel knuckle is now free. Remove the wheel knuckle. If, like us, you broke the ABS sensor during disassembly, we suggest you watch our video, How to Replace the Front ABS Sensor Honda Civic. It shows you all the techniques from removing it efficiently and optimizing its reassembly. Hey, it's Alex from CarParts.com. For great content, our best price, and fast shipping, download the CarParts.com app now. Next, place the wheel knuckle on the press. You now need to press the wheel hub using a hydraulic press in order to extract it from the wheel bearing. Take a 42mm bearing dismantle cup, then press the wheel hub outwards. Removing the wheel hub always damages the wheel bearing, hence the need to replace it at the same time. Bearing retaining rings often become seized up, so don't hesitate to turn them using a flathead screwdriver and hammer. Spray it with penetrating oil to remove it more easily. Using circlip pliers, remove the bearing retaining ring. To effectively push the bearing along the axis of the press, we recommend positioning the wheel knuckle on a press support. This will enable you to adjust its orientation until it's perfect. Take a 74mm bearing dismantle cup, then press the wheel bearing outwards. Once the wheel bearing has been removed, thoroughly clean the location of the wheel bearing in the wheel knuckle using a wire brush and brake cleaner. Apply assembly grease to facilitate the installation of the new bearing. And put it back on the press support. Place the old bearing on top of the new one, since it's exactly the same diameter as the new one, with the bearing dismantling cup on top. Next, press the assembly until the new bearing comes to a stop, or you have the space you need to position the retaining clip. Replace the retaining clip. Use a socket to raise the wheel hub so you don't damage the threaded rods. Place the wheel hub on the press. Apply assembly grease, then position the wheel knuckle on the wheel hub. Get a bearing dismantle cup to press only the central ring of the wheel bearing onto the wheel hub until it stops. The preparation of the new part is now complete. Reinstall the wheel knuckle by inserting the lower ball joint into the control arm. Fully reinsert the CV axle into the wheel hub assembly. Roughly put the hub nut back in place. Insert the wheel knuckle into the strut foot. Replace the bolts. Screw the strut foot bolts back on until they make contact. Finish tightening using a torque wrench. Remove the jack. Then screw the lower ball joint back on. Screw the lower ball joint retaining bolt back onto the control arm until it makes contact. Screw the two nuts back in. Finish tightening using a torque wrench. Clean the wheel hub with brake cleaner and paper towel. Reinstall the brake disc. Screw the two disc retaining screws back on. Clean both sides of the brake disc with brake cleaner and a cloth to remove the grease before installing the new pads. You can now reinstall the caliper assembly. Finish the tightening of the bolts with a torque wrench. Using a wire brush, scrub the knuckle. Then apply silicone grease to the flat part that will be in contact with the sleeve of the outer tie rod. Put the outer tie rod back in place. Apply pressure to the outer tie rod using a jack to prevent the ball joint from rotating when tightening the nut. Put the nut in place and tighten it using a 19mm wrench. Finish tightening using a torque wrench. Take the cotter pin and fit it. You can now bend the cotter pin. Insert the sensor into its housing. Then, screw the retaining bolt back on using the ratchet. Finish tightening using a torque wrench. Clip the ABS sensor cable back onto the strut foot. Clip the cable back onto the brake hose support. Clip the ABS sensor's plastic guide back inside the mudguard. Plug the electrical connector back in. Route the ABS sensor harness through the opening in the body. Put the plastic engine cover back in place and reattach the rivets. Ask another person to press the brake pedal. This will prevent the hub from rotating. Screw the hub nut back on until it makes contact. Then you will be able to put the wheel back on your vehicle. Put your vehicle back on the ground before properly fixing the wheel in place. Finish tightening the hub nut with a torque wrench. Crimp the nut on the end of the CV axle using a pin punch and a hammer. Operation complete.